That is the full story of redemption of a God who shows up, who shares in our anger, weeps with us, shares in our pain, all the while saying, I will walk with you through this very difficult journey. Whatever your journey is, it's a cancer, it's divorce, it's whatever that is, I'm with you. And promise you that when we get to the end, I'm going to overturn the verdict and redemption will be the reality.
Welcome to the podcast series, Why Believe? Exploring the critical questions about Christian faith with Skip Vaccarello. In each episode, Skip will explore topics and tough questions people often ask about God, Jesus, the Bible, and the Christian faith. In each episode, Skip hosts experts who will discuss these topics and help provide answers to the questions that people often ask.
Welcome, everyone. We're in a podcast series titled Why Believe? Exploring the critical questions about Christian faith. The series is for anyone curious about faith, whether you're skeptical, searching, or just looking for thoughtful answers to complex questions. In each episode, I sit down with experts, ask tough questions, and explore the evidence for Christian faith. And the reason for the series is that exploring evidence was critical on my spiritual journey, and I think many people are curious, just as I was, and want to give them the opportunity to investigate the evidence for Christian faith. The topic in this episode is, why does a loving God allow the innocent to suffer? And this is likely one of the most challenging questions about Christian faith. To discuss the question, I have with me two friends and longtime pastors who I admire for their critical thinking, theological knowledge, and compassion, John Ortberg and Hurmon Hamilton. Little background, John's a pastor, author, and speaker who leads an online ministry called Become New, which I highly recommend. He's written several books on spiritual formation. His most recent book is called Steps, A Guide to Transforming Your Life When Willpower Isn't Enough. And his current podcast series on BecomeNew.me discusses these topics from his book. John was born and raised in Rockford, Illinois, graduated from Wheaton College with a degree in psychology and holds a Master's of Divinity and doctorate in clinical psychology from Fuller Seminary. John is a member of the board and trustees at Fuller Seminary and the board of Dallas Willard Center for Spiritual Formation. John, welcome.
Thanks, Skip. Wonderful to be with you.
Well, thank you for being here. And Hurmon Hamilton was born in San Francisco and raised in Coshada, Louisiana. Hurmon earned his BA in Philosophy and History from Grambling State University and his Master's of Divinity from San Francisco Theological Seminary. Hurmon served as the senior pastor of Roxbury Presbyterian Church in Boston for 17 years, and during this time, he also served as an adjunct professor at the Harvard Divinity School and Gordon Conwell Seminary. He was a lecturer at Yale University and a guest preacher at Princeton and Boston University. Pastor Hurmon, as he likes to be called, returned to the Bay Area in 2011 and served as the teaching pastor for Abundant Life Christian Fellowship in Mountain View, California for 2 years. And following his tenure at ALCF, Pastor Hurmon led the birthing of New Beginnings Community Church, starting in April 2014, where today he serves as the senior and founding pastor, leading a large and rapidly growing diverse church community. Pastor Hurmon, welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here with you and with my friend John.
All right, let's get into our discussion. As I said earlier, I believe that the question of why would a loving God allow the innocent to suffer, which is really a question of evil in the world, is one of the biggest barriers to faith that skeptics have. Recently, I talked with a friend who grew up in a Christian home, walked away from faith just over this issue. So here's the dilemma for many skeptics, I believe, is the Bible portrays God as just, merciful, compassionate, and all-powerful. And Jesus is all about love. Allowing the innocent to suffer seems inconsistent with those attributes, leading to questions about God's character and even his existence. So let's start with some theological questions. And John, maybe I'll pose this first question to you, and then Pastor Hurmon, you can feel free to add to it. So the question is, if God is all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful, Why does he allow the innocent people to suffer? Another way to say this is, how can a loving God allow seemingly purposeless and excessive suffering? John, how would you comment?
Well, uh, it's a terrific question, and there really is a pretty simple, easy, straightforward answer to it. Pastor Hurmon? No, I won't punt yet. Um, uh, uh,
Very good.
it is probably the number one, certainly one of the biggest barriers, I think, to faith with people. And unfortunately, uh, a lot of times those of us in the church don't help the cause any because often we will give answers that are simplistic or cliched or even hurtful to people. Uh, there's a wonderful thinker, scholar, church historian, actually, and writer out in the neck of the woods, Skip, where you're living right now, Kate Bowler, who's a Duke.
Hmm.
And she was diagnosed several years ago with advanced cancer, has been kind of kept alive with fairly innovative immunotherapy. And she wrote a book called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies That I Have Loved.
Mm.
And talks about as somebody who is herself a person of faith. She's from a Mennonite background, how often people would just give her um, answers to why she was suffering when nobody knows. And often it was a way to try to help them not have to feel bad because they saw suffering with another person. So I think it's an important place to start is just one of humility to say, there are many, many questions in the world. This is one of many. It's not the only one on which hinges the reality of whether or not there is a God, but there's a lot of mystery to it, and there's a lot that I don't understand. And so I wouldn't want to tell people, Yep, or Pastor Herman, here's why you're suffering, or here's the answer, or you went through this loss because God caused it, or God wants your spouse to be in heaven, or lots of
Mm.
responses like that that the church will sometimes do that is not helpful to people. A book that's been very helpful to me over the last several years is by a philosopher named Eleanor Stump, and it's called Wandering in Darkness. And the title is actually taken from a piece of graffiti that was found at Auschwitz
Hmm.
uh, uh,
Interesting.
after the end of the Second World War. And it's a very dense book, but a very thoughtful book. She is a formidable intellect and a very strong believer. Part of what she points out when it comes to this problem, the problem of suffering or evil, is maybe 40 years ago, she would say in philosophical circles, often it was thought that it kind of made faith a non-starter. But part of the points that she makes is for that to work, if it actually destroyed the possibility of faith, you would have to prove that it would be impossible to hold that there is a God who is loving and a God who is all powerful and that there's evil in the world. And she says it's very clear there's no way that somebody can prove that those three statements are not compatible with each other. Doesn't mean that we'll be able to come up with the answer for why there is evil in the world, but it means simply stating those three propositions doesn't make faith impossible. And the main thing that she does in the book, Skip, is to consider what does it mean to defeat evil or to redeem evil. And she says, uh, ultimately, it means in the life of somebody, in the long run, that a good will have come to them through their journey of life, including the evil, suffering, pain that they have gone through, that is something that they would not want to give up, even if it meant they didn't have to go through that suffering. That evil is redeemed when all things considered, as I look at my existence, I say, I would rather have had my existence, even with the suffering that happened in it, than not to have had my existence at all. And so obviously not just life in this world, but an eternal perspective. And what is God up to in an eternal perspective is a key part of the consideration of that from a Christian perspective. I'll mention one other thing at this point, and then I'd love to hear from my brother, Pastor Hurmon. I was asking another philosopher who's been real helpful to me, Dallas Willard, about the problem of evil and suffering. What does he think about it as a person of faith when he considers it? And he said, it makes him think about how great God's project is.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Wow.
Hmm.
And I had not thought about that before, but it made me think a little bit about, in fractions, if you look at a fraction and you know what the bottom number is, but you don't know what the top number is yet, you don't know the value of the whole number. And so it's like in this world, if the bottom number is all of the suffering and evil, we know it's vast, it's horrendous, it's incredibly huge. What we don't know yet is in the scope of eternity, with a God who's willing to take suffering on himself and says the day is coming when he will wipe away every tear and sickness and sorrow will be no more. How much goodness in the eternal scale of things does God's project involve? And the thought that that amount could be so vast that the evil and suffering, as vast as it is from our finite perspective, would actually be a drop next to the amount of goodness that we will one day all see. That was a perspective I had not thought of before.
Let me
And
just comment before Pastor Hurmon speaks, but John, I think it's a very good point. I think we as followers of Jesus, when you have an eternal perspective, the sufferings of this world, seem to pale in terms of that. And not to dismiss them at all, because they're certainly real. But we don't know God's purposes in everything. But it does give some hope and encouragement when we know that there is eternity, and our life here is so short compared to eternity. So, I mean, I hadn't thought about it that way, but I love that perspective. Pastor Hurmon, comments?
Wow, I just love uh, John's insight on that and your commenting on that perspective. Let me just reinforce something that John said initially. I'll just say it a little differently, and that is that this is an academic conversation. And if you're living through suffering, it is not an academic experience. And so there's no way that, you know, any of the things that we're going to say is going to necessarily universally apply to every situation. But certainly, hopefully, it's going to create some new thought categories for people to do the processing through which. And I just think what John just said was just incredible, especially the point around the larger project that God has at work. Let me just add to it with two things when I think about this question. I think you said, Skip, let me just ask you again. Didn't you say the question is, how is it that an all-powerful God allows evil and suffering in the world? Is that how you framed the
Yes,
question?
that's correct. Yep.
Okay. And then my response is that while God is all-powerful, he's not all-controlling. I think there's a distinct difference in that whole piece.
Mm.
And oftentimes we talk about the fact that, the suggestion is that because God is on the throne, that's where we get this notion everything happens for a reason. But God is not all controlling. And a real close look at scripture, you'll see that from the very, very beginning. Even in the story of Adam and Eve, in order for the I-thou relationship to be healthy, there has to be the freedom of choice. Just like in order for you and me to have a healthy relationship, there has to be freedom of choice. And so God could have said in that classic story of Genesis 3, he could have said, what God actually says is, hey guys, don't eat from this tree. He could have just put a force field around it. and called it a day, right?
I hadn't thought about that.
He could have put an electric fence around it and say, "Hey, you get past here, we're gonna shock you into reality." I mean, do not touch. He could have prohibited it, but he didn't, because that story is a classic story about what authentic, healthy relationship is, and that, and particularly authentic, healthy love relationship, that requires the freedom of choice. And it also creates a context of, I like to say it this way, love also has a context of trust. So in this grand project, just to take from what John says, whatever it is, God is trying to create an authentic relationship between us and God and between us and us, that allows for healthy love, that it has implicit at the very center of it real trust. And, you know, if the love doesn't have trust, then it's either over controlling or it is overwhelmingly insecure. I'll give you a perfect example just to drive that home. When I married my wife many years ago, now 39 years ago, when I first got, I had a history of being a scarred kid. And John, I used to say as a teenager, I chased a lot of girls. I just couldn't catch any of them. This kind of flowed into my college days. And then Rhonda came into my life, fell head over heels in love, and we got married in 11 months. Maybe the first 5 to 10 years of our marriage, I just assumed every day I was going to wake up, and that was the day that Rhonda was going to come to her senses, that she had married this scarred and wholly inadequate fella. What was she thinking? And so therefore she would leave. So I just didn't trust that was a love experience. And as a result of that, I did a lot of crazy things to try to accelerate her leaving. And so just to bring it back, God wants a relationship with us where he is not over controlling. He is not trying to control everything. It's a relationship that is built on a love that has at the very center of it trust, which is what Adam and Eve violated. And because of that, we get to make choices. And our choices, whether good or bad, have ripple effect all across the globe and all across relationships. The other thing that I'd say to this is other things that's really quick is this notion of God not being all control and he's kind of built-in freedom is not just in terms of human affairs. I think it's in terms of creation at large, that there is a freedom for our atoms and our neurons and electrons biologically, and what's going on in the atmosphere. There's a freedom for it to interact with stuff that's happening in our bodies and around it. And so this notion that God is not all controlling, I think extends across creation, partly why we say sin has affected everything, because at the end of the day, there's just profound implications when humanity as whole kind of steps outside of the boundaries of God. So the last thing I want to say, as relates to this, gets to this point around John's perspective of eternity. Skip, I did some research. You stay around Raleigh, Durham, right?
Yes.
Okay. So if I took a flight, I want to talk about this in terms of perspective of time. John mentions that eternity, God is doing something from an eternal perspective. And I think we have a significant shift between God's perspective of time and our perspective. So here it is. I did this research. If I fly from San Francisco to Raleigh, Durham, it takes about 5 to 6 hours, right, Skip?
Yes, that's correct. Yep.
Okay. I'm told that if I drive it, it's about 2,700 to 2,900 miles, it takes about 40 to 50 hours.
Yep.
Uh, then I was wondering, how much would it take if I walked it? And so I did the research, and it says it would take, if I walked about 20 miles a day, it would take me 4 to 5 months.
Mm.
And then I wondered, what if I was an ant? And as an ant, I tried to make the journey. And the research suggests, well, if the ant doesn't go in a straight line, but just for purposes of this discussion, let's say an ant would go 0.1 miles per day. It would take that ant over 3 years to make the same journey that we make in a matter of hours by flight.
Mm.
Here's my point. I think it's Second Peter that says this. One day with the Lord is as 1,000 years with human beings. He didn't say it. He's not equating them. He's just saying it's like. He's giving us an analogus. And so the suggestion is we often look back and we say, how can God allow this suffering to happen for year after year and decade after decade and ages after ages? And the answer is we're traveling this life at the pace of an ant. But God's perspective is at the height of flying from San Francisco to Durham. It's a matter of hours. It's a matter of days. And so God is moving. We just can't sense it. But what God is doing that will ultimately bring redemption to the world. He says in Revelation, I will make all things right. It's happening in a matter of days from God's perspective, not years or thousands of years. And so I just found that to be helpful to just think about my perspective of time versus God's perspective of time, and realizing that he's given me freedom of choice that's creating a whole lot of mess. But part of what makes him all powerful is that he's able to work through all of this craziness,
yes,
and bring redemption out at the end.
Yeah, excellent point. I hadn't thought about that analogy. It's a good analogy, Pastor Hurmon. I want to go back on one of the things that you mentioned. You talked a bit about freedom or free will, right? So that's, a loving God has given us the freedom to act. And sometimes, as in the case of Adam and Eve, we'll act against God's will. And that can cause some of all the problems really we have in human suffering. And you had touched on the whole issue of sort of natural disasters. And I'd like, as we've seen John, you're in Southern California, we've seen the fires in Southern California where many innocent people have been killed. And there are many other natural disasters. As I said earlier, we had a tornado warning here. Fortunately, nothing happened, but there are tornadoes, there are earthquakes, and all sorts of things. And quote, innocent people, are killed or suffer in those. So, John, do you have any other comments? How does this fit into a loving God that's allowing some of these natural disasters to happen?
Yeah, I think coming back to what Pastor Hurmon was saying, the traditional Christian understanding is suffering, evil, significant suffering, entered into reality not because God wanted it or God willed it, but because of the fall, because people chose and we chose badly and our wills are oriented against God. I was thinking, Herman, as you were talking, how the story of Adam and Eve is so interesting. Even before sin, when Eve is talking with the serpent, the character who's not present is God.
Right.
And a little later, it says they heard God walking in the quiet of the day.
Yes. Yes.
So what does that mean? Well, that means that before then, he wasn't walking around there. And so I take it the picture that is creating is God values freedom and personhood, really, and understanding the worth of persons, the dignity of persons, and the centrality of will and freedom to personhood is terribly important, often lost in our day, often lost in certain views of science or scientism that doesn't actually recognize personhood. And that is so valuable to God that God is willing to absent himself to make it possible for there to be freedom. And we see that in the story of even the conversation that's happening with Eve and the serpent, and God not being there to give her freedom. So, this is something that is greatly prized by God. And then when the fall happens, sin and death enter in, and they enter into all of creation. So Paul talks about the idea of creation being subjected to frustration. So part of what
Yeah.
happens is that we experience ourselves, and then it might be hypothetically possible, for if I shoot at somebody, God to turn the bullets into rubber so they don't hurt them. But ultimately, if there's not, C.S. Lewis writes about this, a physical creation that has certain reliable laws, then any kind of meaningful life is not possible. And so it's the nature of creation that it has to obey those kind of laws for us to be able to interact with each other in the way that we do. And then death, evil, things like tornadoes, and so have entered into creation. I don't know why. Uh, I'm living in Southern California, and we had horrendous fires here quite recently. I don't know why they strike one home and they don't strike another home. Ultimately, the only recourse I have on that one is that God will one day redeem all of that suffering.
Mm.
Um, I do think I'll say one other thing about Hurmon's comment, because there's some people who picture God controlling, fires and cancer cells in bodies and all that sort of thing. And uh, I don't think that that's the best way to think about God or the best way to understand him from scripture. So that notion that Pastor Hurmon talks about, that God is overseeing his project, but God is allowing for there to be freedom in space at all kinds of levels. There's a physicist at Oxford, Andrew Steen, who's a Christian, and he's written a book about science and faith. And he talks about the interaction between theology and science, and how in the 17th century, Newtonian physics would often cause people to think in a very deterministic way about theology. So, reality, the universe must be a big machine and must operate according to certain ways that would be completely predictable, and therefore God has determined everything that's happening. And so, theological systems tended to uh, reflect a more Newtonian picture of the universe. Steen says now, with what we know about physics, indeterminacy principle, and so on, there is a certain kind of unpredictability built into reality at its very core, as I understand it. Skip, my son is a physicist, and like I can't track him for more than a sentence or two. But Steen says actually that picture of reality fits the God of the Bible much better than this real mechanistic, determined character. The God of the Bible seems to be a very improvisational God.
Yeah,
We'll
yeah,
just say, oh,
yeah.
yeah, here's a wandering Aramean, here's a bunch of nomads. Yeah, I can use them. Sure, that's fine. And he's a God who it's almost like a great chef on one of those cooking shows. You just throw different ingredients. Yeah, I can use
Yeah.
that. I can make something out of that. And so that picture that we have of reality now, as opposed to 400 or 500 years ago, just at the core level of physics, actually seems to mirror or look kind of like this very improvisational God in the New Testament, much more than this removed, mechanistic, deterministic character that folks talked about a few centuries ago.
That's absolutely right. I love that, John. I love it.
Yeah, excellent, excellent points. Well,
And by the way, Skip, see, that's an all-powerful God that
right.
John is describing, not an all-controlling God. It's
That
wonderful.
is such a distinction. It makes sense. Many people don't think about it that way. An all-powerful God would stop these things from happening, but he's not all controlling. You think about it, if he did stop, everything where there's going to be a disaster or somebody's going to be killed, then whatever, life would be different and not necessarily better, right? If he were to interrupt, if free will were to be taken away from us, I think life would be really a lot different than it
Yeah,
is.
and if nature did not follow certain consistent patterns, meaningful life wouldn't be possible.
Yeah.
And that doesn't explain this fire or that earthquake, and it certainly doesn't justify glib or cliched responses to it. But it is to say, meaningful life with persons who have freedom requires a certain context for them. Kind of like if you're going to play chess, the chess pieces have to stay put. If they're wandering around all, you can't play the game. So there's a kind of backdrop that is required for meaningful and free human life. That's the world in which we live.
And you both made the point, which is a good one, that in the end, nature, humans will be redeemed. In the end, it's again having this eternal perspective that there will ultimately in the end, and that's why Jesus came, there will be redemption in the end. I think that's an important point.
Yeah, and one more comment on that one. And again, there's a lot that this doesn't answer, but it's very striking when Paul's writing to the church at Romans, Romans 8, and he says, creation itself was subjected to frustration.
Yeah. Yes.
And going back to the Genesis story that Hurmon was talking about, after the fall, the ground's going to produce thorns and thistles.
Yeah.
And so it seems that our fall, and of course, we see this directly in things like our willingness to pollute and not care for the
Yes.
environment.
That's
And
what I
so,
said. Yes.
as
Yes.
Christians,
Yes.
we ought to be real interested in our treatment of animals. As if
Yes.
kind of striking to look at what the scripture says about the proper treatment of animals, and that up until the time of Noah, apparently vegetarianism was the way of life for those characters, that in some way our fall has impacted all of creation. And one little piece of that seems to be now the pain that we experience and that creation itself experiences is a reminder that things are not the way that they are supposed to be.
Right.
And that's true inside me, and that's true in the world around me. So I cannot look to the world around me to bring the ultimate satisfaction that finitude cannot bring. And we are together somehow in a place of frustration and woundedness, so that we will look together for a goodness that is beyond ourselves. And that when it does come, it will be healing not only for human souls, but for everything that God has created.
Mm.
And we're not alone in that journey. I mean, let me just, I just piggybacking on what John is saying. I mean, one of the reasons why I'm obviously we're all Christians. What's unique, one of the uniqueness about the Christian faith, one of the distinctions between, in some ways, of how God shows up in the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, and how God shows up in the New Testament. And it's from a Christian perspective, it's all rolling in the same direction, is that God is not standing on the sideline watching this stuff, right, as it unfolds. And he'll show up at the end and make it work. Here's one of my favorite, adaptions of the classic story. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. I always like to just have a little fun with that and say that Tyrone and Shaquita went up the hill. And while they were going up the hill, Tyrone was bothering Shaquita so much that when they got to the top of the hill, Jack stooped over and Shaquita said, "I'm gonna get you," and she just tipped him in the back, and he went tumbling down. And Shaquita says, "Oh my God, what have I done?" And so she falls. He goes tumbling down there. Anyway, I love that little. Here is the point, though, that in a sense, God makes humanity and he puts us at the top of the hill. And humanity, on the basis of our own choices, steps outside of God's boundaries and find humanity falling down the hill. And God comes tumbling after. And that story unfolds itself in the person of Jesus, right? God shows up in our suffering. This is the remarkable story of a God who says, I love you so that I will not abandon you to the suffering, whether it is the fires breaking out in LA, is it someone who's dealing with cancer, or whatever the expression of suffering that shows up in the world. I'm not going to stand on beyond the dim mist of eternity and hope that things work out for you or catch you at the end. I'm going to show up in the midst of that suffering, and the cross being in its day the worst expression of human suffering. I'm going to enter that experience both as a work of redemption, but also as a unforgettable representation for you that says, I'm with you in your suffering. And what John says is that there's this notion that I have to believe in that's a good outside of my content, that if I can partner with that good in my suffering, then good can come out from my suffering. Exactly right. And that person, that God shows up in the one called Jesus. It fills our life from a Christian standpoint through the power of the Holy Spirit. And God says, I'm going to show up in your suffering circumstances, and together we will partner, and I will weep with you when you weep. This is Jesus and Mary. I love this story, chapter 11 of John, of the Gospel of John. John, you and I have talked about this before. Lazarus dies. Jesus shows up what appears to be really late, 4 days. Lazarus has been buried. It's a great story. Mary and Elizabeth are siblings to Lazarus. As far as Mary is concerned, she's thinking, you gonna show up now? We called again and again and you didn't come. You're gonna show up now? Elizabeth went to meet Jesus. Mary stays at home. It's a wonderful text. You know that, John. That wonderful phrase in the text says, Elizabeth goes to meet him. Mary stays at home. It's like, I don't want to see him. My brother's dead now. And you didn't say anything? You didn't send me a message? Nothing? Now you're going to come? I don't want to see him. This is a reality of humanity struggling with where is God in the midst of our suffering. This is the story right here, right? And then Elizabeth comes back and says to Mary, the master is calling for you. Mary simply out of goes. And what does she do when she gets there? I love it. She is authentically honest in her reaction. If you could read the text in this little like, she yells at Jesus, screams at him, falls at his feet, yelling and screaming, Jesus, had you been here, my brother would not have died. By implications, it's either directly your fault or it's indirectly your fault because you could have stopped it and you didn't. What does Jesus do? Perfect picture of the God we serve in Jesus. The first thing it says is, and an anger welled up in him, not at her, but with her. This is John's point where Jesus is saying, I share in your anger because you know what? Your brother shouldn't have died. This is a byproduct of a broken world that's functioning the way I didn't intend for it to function. So I share with you in your anger. I meet you in your anger. It's okay for you to be angry. He didn't cuss her out. He didn't say, how dare you? He didn't do any of that stuff. He shares with her in anger. And then his next response is, where have you laid him? They say, come see. And then the text says, Jesus wept. Now, John, here's what I find fascinating about the text. I think Jesus knew that he was going to raise Lazarus when he got there. I'm not sure, but I think he did. So if it was me, I would have said, cool out. It's going to be all right. Chill. Let's got this. Let's go to the graveyard. No. He shares in her anger. The text says he wept. He booed with her. And then he walked with her on her. You know what a horrible journey that was to go from there to the graveyard? You know how horrible that journey was? What a grief journey that was. And then when he gets there, he overturns the verdict of death and calls Lazarus forth. That is the full story of redemption of a God who shows up, who shares in our anger, weeps with us, shares in our pain, all the while saying, I will walk with you through this very difficult journey. Whatever your journey is, it's a cancer, it's divorce, it's whatever that is, I'm with you. And I'm promising you that when we get to the end, I'm going to overturn the verdict and redemption will be the reality. That's the God we serve in Jesus inside of this suffering God.
No, I love that. And it's probably worth saying, Skip, to folks who listen and are experiencing suffering, that angry expression of lament and protest to God is actually the most frequent kind of psalm in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures, the Psalm of Lament. Complaining to God, crying out to God is the single most common form of a psalm. And there's another woman at Duke, Eileen Davis, who writes, it's true as far as I know, in the ancient world, only Israel had prayers like that.
Wow.
Had psalms like that.
Interesting.
There would be lots of imprecatory prayers in the ancient world. Zeus, I don't like how this guy looked at my wife, plucked both of his eyes out, calls for God to act in vengeance. She writes, only Israel prayed those prayers of protest and lament and complaint to God because only they believed there was a God who was willing to hear those kinds of prayers.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
And cared about the suffering and lament.
Yes.
There's nobody else who was praying that way. I thought that's such a powerful expression of what it is that was revealed to people about the nature of this God.
Yes. And John, you've got, how many grandkids you have?
Two.
And Skip, how many you have?
I have six.
Six. Okay. And I know this about, I don't have any grandkids. I'm envious of you, both of you. But anyway, I know this about my kids. When they're really hurting, and your grandkids, when they're really hurting, they come to you and they're crying uncontrollably. Just to build on John's point, you welcome them, you put your arms around them, more than likely you will cry with them. To let them come to you and cry is to enter into their pain.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This is the point that I guess the scholar's writing about Israel and Israel's God, who we come to know in Jesus Christ. To welcome that is to enter into your pain.
Yeah, and I think in many ways it makes the Bible even more believable when these are recorded, when these faithful people cry out to God.
Yeah.
In their pain and suffering. And the point is that God is with them, and they know that. I have an example in the story of Job, and the listeners may or may not know, but Job was this person that was a wealthy man. He had lots of property, lots of wealth, good health, and then through this, I guess, bargain with Satan, he suffered incredibly. And in the midst of that suffering, he cried out to God. And I'll just read a couple of verses from this. This is from chapter 30. And this is what Job says. He says, I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me. You turn on me ruthlessly. With the might of your hand, you attack me. You snatch me up and drive me before the wind. You toss me about the storm. I know you will bring me back down to death in the place appointed for all living. Certainly no one lays a hand on a broken man when he cries for help in his distress. Have I not to weep in my trouble? Has not my soul grieved for the poor? Yet when I have hoped for good, evil came. When I looked for the light, then came darkness. The churning inside me never stops. Days of suffering confront me. And we probably all know of people who were faithful believers that go through
100%.
who go through incredible suffering.
Yes.
And in the end, and I guess it's an example for all of us, Job is redeemed. He remains faithful to God through all of this. And to me, it's a great example. And it makes the Bible even more believable.
Yeah, and I like to just say, oftentimes, the Christian faith is not a parachute by which we escape the realities of what it means to be human and be human in a broken world.
Yeah.
You know, we because we are human in a broken world, Christians are susceptible to every other form of suffering that anybody else is susceptible to. But we are susceptible to it with a hope and a promise. And the hope and the promise is that we're not alone in it and that we are in partnership with a God who's with us and who is working with us and in it and through it in some ways that we cannot understand. The way the Job story ends up, right? God will redeem it at the end of the day. He comes out. We still don't have all the answers to Job's questions, uh, but he's a different Job when he comes out of that whole piece.
Well, let me ask you maybe a different question. We've been talking a lot on, the theology of things, and John, I think earlier you had mentioned that, as we're getting this discussion, a lot of it is sort of intellectual and theological, but that doesn't always happen. That always doesn't always help the person who is suffering right there and in the moment. So both of you have been longtime pastors. You've had to comfort uh, to parents who have experienced the death of a young child or have gone through some other disaster. So how would you, maybe Pastor Hurmon, you can go first. How do you respond when somebody comes to you in such desperation and pain because they've had, a young child or a spouse or somebody that has died or been severely harmed? As a pastor, how do you respond to that person?
Well, I'll tell you a story. First of all, let me just contextualize it by saying I don't know that there's a perfect response. I do know there's some horrible responses, but I don't know that there's a perfect response, that there's an adequate response when you've had horrendous loss. When I was pastoring in Boston, I had a member who was a part of our team whose daughter ended up murdered, and her body was set on fire and she was burned to ashes. That is the height of evil in the world. And I showed up at the house. I immediately went to the house. House was full of people. The first hour, she wasn't seeing anyone, and so actually, when I got there, I just sent word to her and say, just let her know that Pastor Hurmon is here. I'm okay. I just want her to know I'm here. So I just sit for an hour with the family. And then she sent for me to come to the bedroom. And I went back. The mom did, talking to mom. She can't get out of bed. She's so writhed with pain. And she says to me, she says, Pastor, she said, I surround my kids with prayer every single day. Hmm. And she went through the prayers of protection that she prayed for each kid, so forth. And then she said, how could God let this happen? I've been faithful. I don't understand it. How could God let this happen? Why? And she cried, and I cried with her. I said to her, I don't know. I found in these times that oftentimes being honest with the I don't know, because we don't, is the best place to start. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I don't understand it. I said to her, the only thing that I do know is that the God that you trusted knows what it's like to lose a son, to have a son brutally and horribly murdered. That he gets that. And that the God that you and I trust, when it was all said and done, got to have his son back because of the resurrection of Jesus. I said, those are the only two things I know. A, he's with you in your suffering. B, the horror of this evil will not be the last word. But until then, we're going to just cry together.
Very good. John, any other comments?
Well, I think that says it all. It makes me want to have Pastor Hurmon for my pastor. I think probably one of the most violated commands in Bible is Paul talking to the church at Rome, rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn.
That's a good way to end. Just mourn with those who mourn and don't try to explain anything. John and Hurmon, thank you for the discussion. The innocent, suffering, and evil in the world are tough topics, and I appreciate your insight. On skipvaccarello.com, I have a list of resources for people to learn more about the questions that we discussed in this episode and the other episodes in the series. I urge our listeners to continue to explore evidence for Christian faith. There's no more important decision in life that we can make than where to put our faith and trust. And if you're in the Bay Area, check out New Beginnings Community Church. Pastor Hurmon's sermons are also online at nbccbayarea.com. That's nbccbayarea.com. Hurmon's a fantastic preacher. You will benefit from listening to his messages. And I strongly suggest you listen to John's daily podcast on becomenew.com. That's become new, all one word, becomenew.com. John explores many topics, from theological subjects to practical ways to live out Christian faith. Give his podcasts a try. I love them and believe you will also. John and Hurmon, again, thank you very much for being with us, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in.
Thanks, Skip. Thanks, Hurmon.
Thanks, guys.
If you'd like to explore this question and other topics discussed in this series, Why Believe? Exploring the critical questions about Christian faith, check out the other episodes in this podcast series by going to skipvaccarello.com. You'll also find resources for each podcast there. Thank you for listening.